Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 793 for November 17th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
The joke at the time was, if it turns out to be bad, we're going to have to drink it all ourselves. And if it turns out to be really good, we're going to drink it all ourselves. If it's in the middle somewhere, we'll maybe sell it.
Francis Cuthbert and his brother Ian were pioneers among Scotland's modern-day craft distillers, and their Daftmill Farm distillery in the lowlands of Fife is a throwback to more historic times when farmers worked their fields during the spring, summer, and fall, then ran their stills during the winter. The Cuthbert brothers also waited 12 years to bottle their first single malt whiskey just last year. Now, the first bottles of Daftmill single malt are just reaching the U.S. market. I'll talk with Daftmill's Francis Cuthbert on WhiskyCast In-Depth. We'll also have the calendar of events, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and much more, all on this edition of WhiskyCast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. We'll begin by updating a story we brought you back in September when there were major questions being asked about the future of the Kentucky Bourbon Festival in Bardstown. While the festival's board of directors is still searching for a permanent executive director, they have firmly put an end to rumors that the festival might move from its traditional mid-September schedule. This week they announced the 2020 Kentucky Bourbon Festival will run from September 16th through the 20th. That puts it just ahead of the Kentucky Bourbon Affair and the Bourbon and Beyond Music Festival the following weekend. Both take place in Louisville. Tickets for Bourbon Festival events will go on sale next summer. Back in August, we heard from Uncle Nearest whiskey founder Fawn Weaver in episode 779. At the time, the new Uncle Nearest 1884 Tennessee whiskey was just making its debut, and it was curated by Victoria Edie Butler, Nathan Nearest Green's great-great-granddaughter. Fawn Weaver told us back then that while there was a tasting panel going through the whiskeys for the final blend, Victoria had the final say.
There were some where we did not like it for one reason or another, and Victoria would say, well, I like it and this is the reason why, and it would go in. So what is here, I'm incredibly proud of, but the family, Nearest's family, is so incredibly proud of because it was truly their batch. And so I told Victoria that whiskey is clearly in her blood.
This week, Victoria Edie Butler was named the Master Blender for Uncle Nearest. According to Weaver, that makes her the first known African-American Master Blender in the industry. We send along our congratulations. Now, let's turn to the courts and yet another lawsuit over whiskey trademark rights. The owners of Washington, D.C.-based Joseph A. Magnus and Company have filed a lawsuit against Highland Park's owners over their Highland Park Magnus single malt scotch. The lawsuit was filed against Highland Distillers, which is Highland Park's official parent company in Scotland. Edrington owns majority control of Highland Distillers, with the rest of the company in private hands. According to the Washington City paper, which first reported the lawsuit, it claims Edrington essentially ignored Joseph A. Magnus's trademark rights to the word Magnus. It started selling Joseph A. Magnus branded whiskeys in 2015 2 years before Highland Park introduced its Magnus single malt, named after the distillery's founder, Magnus Junsen. The suit also claims federal regulators rejected Edrington's attempts to register trademarks for Magnus because it infringed on Joseph A. Magnus's rights. The suit also names the owners of Reserve Bar, an online retailer that sold the Highland Park Magnus whiskey in the District of Columbia, at least until the lawsuit was filed. Now, the suit was filed on November 6th, and lawyers for Edrington and Reserve Bar have not yet filed their responses. We reached out to both sides in the case. Both declined to comment on the suit. We'll keep you posted as this one works its way through the legal system. On that note, a Triskelion sounds like something that ought to be in a Star Trek episode, but it's actually Highland Park's newest whiskey. A Triskelion is actually a design that features a symmetrical triple spiral that sort of looks like a fidget spinner. It's an appropriate name for this whiskey, which was created by current Highland Park master whiskey maker Gordon Motion in collaboration with his predecessors, Max McFarlane and John Ramsey. It's the only whiskey that all three have collaborated on, and it'll go on sale this month worldwide, except for the U.S., where it will be available in early 2020. The UK price tag is £170 a bottle, or around $219 at current exchange rates. Now, Gordon Motion has also been busy with another Edrington brand. He's also the master whiskey maker for the Glenrothes, which unveiled a 40-year-old single malt this week. Only 594 bottles will be available worldwide, with 60 coming to the U.S. The price tag is £2,950 in the UK. The U.S. edition will sell for $4,000 a bottle. We heard from Lafroig's John Campbell last time around, but it turns out he was holding out on us just a little bit. This week, Beam Suntory announced that Lafroig is reviving its 16-year-old expression as a permanent part of the distillery's core lineup, with plans to release a new batch each year. It's bottled at 48% ABV and will sell for around $90 a bottle in the U.S. Meanwhile, Beam Suntory is teaming up with Amazon to release an online-only exclusive Auchentoshan single malt in the UK. It's finished in Sauvignon Blanc wine barrels, and it'll sell for £50 a bottle at the Amazon UK website. Sagamore Spirit released a unique straight rye whiskey Saturday at the distillery in Baltimore. It's unique because it's the first bottling of aged whiskey distilled on Sagamore Spirit's own still. Penny's proof is 2.5 years old and gets its name from the still, which is nicknamed Penny. It went on sale exclusively to members of the Whiskey Thieves, Sagamore Spirit's fan club, with a 3-pack of 200-milliliter bottles costing just a penny. Last year, we talked with writer Dave Broom about the documentary The Amber Light that he's featured in. The film is out now, and there's also a whiskey to go along with it. Dave selected a Thompson Brothers 23-year-old single cask from Ben Nevis to carry the Amber Light name. It's only available through Royal Mile Whiskies with a catch. Those people who contributed to the film's Kickstarter campaign get first crack at it until November 25th. They were emailed a special code that gives them access to order the bottle, and whatever's left on the 25th will go on sale for £164.95 a bottle. Now, this is the time of year we usually see a bunch of new whiskey books being published just in time for the holidays. For instance, the 4th edition of Ian Buxton's classic 101 Whiskeys to Try Before You Die came out this week. It covers some of his favorite whiskeys from all over the world. Writer and longtime brand ambassador Robin Robinson is currently touring the U.S. for signings of his new book, The Complete Whiskey Course. I caught up with Robin earlier this month in Boston.
Well, the idea was to actually make this, walk that balance of enough depth for a whiskey drinker, but to make it wide, open, and accessible and unintimidating for the non-whiskey drinker. So hopefully I've walked that balance in between there.
And you've run the entire gamut from the basics all the way up to a special course for each whiskey, right?
Exactly. So it follows like a course session, 10 courses. The first one's all about the history, the production, flavor profiles. One is on how to taste and smell. And then each major whiskey-making country gets their own chapter. And then the world gets its own chapter. And then there's a chapter on whiskey at home, which is where to get more whiskey information, how to do a tasting inside your own home, retailers out there, bars to go to, and places to actually go find more knowledge like WhiskyCast.
Who's this targeted to, the new person or somebody who's been drinking for years?
Well, hopefully I've actually targeted both. The difficulty of this was not to jump down rabbit holes, but to bring the elevate it up, but still not dumb anything down. So that was the challenge. Whether or not I've accomplished that, it will remain to be seen. Yeah.
Are you surprised by the interest we're seeing in whiskey now? This boom does not appear to be subsiding at all.
Yeah, thank God for that. That means I can still keep selling the books. Well, no, I think we're on a long trend. I still think we've got another 10, 15 years on this for a long time. Everyone knows the marketplace is getting much more crowded. So I'm not sure we're at peak whiskey yet, but the interest is now into what I call third wave. So the bleeding edge people have already been into it. The influencers have now been part of it, and now it's actually breaking open into the larger public. And I think that's actually where the growth's at.
Richard Thomas's latest book, American Whiskey, comes out on December 10th and is available now for pre-orders online. It looks at virtually every American distillery that makes whiskeys today, from small to large. And if you're in the Louisville area, Copper and King's Distillery in Louisville will be hosting Bookstock, a spirits and cocktail book fair, on December 6th and 7th with more than 20 authors on hand to sign their books. There are whiskey bars, and then there are whiskey bars. Jack Rose Dining Saloon in Washington, D.C. definitely falls into the latter category. It's become a bucket list destination for whiskey lovers visiting Washington. Now, Bill Thomas and his team have expanded to open the Imperial, just a few doors down from Jack Rose. It also happens to make room for more whiskey in Jack Rose.
Well, we just opened up a sister restaurant 2 doors down, which will specialize in all other spirits. Although we had an inaugural event, which was Scotch. Doesn't make much sense, but, we couldn't help it. Look, we have an oyster bar there, and Lefroy Select was a great pairing for it. So we did that event. But we're going to be specializing in brandies and cognacs and mezcals, tequilas, rums, all vintage. So we have a ton of stuff, like 400 or 500 selections. We're trying to inventory it now. It's crazy.
So how many Scotch, how many whiskeys do you have?
At Jack Rose or the new place?
At Jack Rose.
About 2,700. But that'll fluctuate any week by a couple hundred. We're selling about 10,000 bottles a year by the dram. So we're it's as fast as I can get to inventory. Sometimes a week or two may go by and we could drop 400 whiskeys in no time. Depends on the month.
So when are you guys going to apply for the Guinness Book of World Records for the world's biggest whiskey bar? Because you've got at least twice as many as the current record holder.
You know what? We had talked about that a while ago, but really, I guess it's about having the right whiskeys. And I think with Jack Rose, even over the years that we've been building Jack Rose, the whiskeys have gotten more narrow in focus, and that is the selections I think are far better that are in there, of the ones that are there, than at the beginning when you were just buying everything you could. So, it's funny, we don't really think about the numbers game as much as we think about really going deep on the ones that we like. So I think we are going to naturally grow because we have a new whiskey bar that's going in the basement, a whiskey tasting room, because the cocktail bar that was in the basement is moving to the new bar. So we have about 250 new whiskeys getting ready to go into that. But it's really, for us, it's going with the brands that we love, going with the vintage, say, Cadden Heads from back in the day, or Willets from back in the day, and really getting as many of those as we can and getting as many bottles of the particular ones that we like. I'd rather have 10 bottles of the same one if I can recommend it, if I love it, than having 10 different ones, And I think that's our focus now. We're really just narrowing it down to the whiskeys we love.
So are people drinking more now under the Trump administration than they were under Obama?
Whiskey has gone up. In the 8.5 years we've been open, it goes up every year, regardless of who's in. So it's that whole thing, do you drink when things are good or when things are bad? People are just drinking whiskey. It's still the hot category. Even at the new place that just opened a few days ago, people are coming in and asking for whiskey. So we had to, I had to bring in some extras this week. Just in the 3 days we've been open, I've had to increase the selection by about 10 new bottles because people are asking for them. And it's everything from Lafroig to Angel's Envy. It's all over the map. People are just drinking whiskey. So that's it. That's a great thing. Just drink whiskey. That's what we say.
Not a bad idea, Bill. Finally, we have some sad news to report. Gary Gaz Regan was the bartender's bartender, and one hell of a writer, too. Among other things, he wrote The Bartender's Bible and The Joy of Mixology, and a bunch of other books. He mentored both bartenders and writers alike, and gave the world far more than he took from it. Gaz's wife, Amy Gallagher, shared the news that Gaz died Friday night after a bout with pneumonia. He was 68 years old, and he'll be missed. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. Fitzgerald was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the upcoming limited edition releases of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. I'm back in the studio this week, but not for long. Next time around, I'll be in Fredericton, New Brunswick for the annual New Brunswick Spirits Festival. If you're in the area, there are still a few tickets available for Friday night's grand tasting, along with a few of the master classes. I hope to meet some of you there. I'll also be at the Victoria Whiskey Festival in British Columbia, again this January, along with Dramfest 2020 this coming March in Christchurch, New Zealand. It's always great to hit the road and meet more whiskey lovers. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Extravaganza comes to Boston this coming Friday night, November 21st. Whiskey Live Dublin is Friday and Saturday at the Dublin Castle Printworks. Interwhiskey runs all weekend long in Frankfurt, Germany, and the Lakes Distillery in Setmurthy, England, will have its holiday lighting celebration this coming Saturday. Christie's will have its next auction of rare spirits and wines November 28th and 29th in London. As we head into December, Whiskey Fest New York is on December 3rd. Michael Veitch's Bourbon Salon will have its annual Repeal Day event at Oxmoor Farm in Louisville on the 5th. And Buffalo Trace Distillery in Frankfort, Kentucky will have its annual Lighting of the Trace holiday celebration that same night. Stranahan's Distillery in Denver, Colorado will have its annual Snowflake Single Malt Release event on the 7th. And Maker's Mark Distillery in Loretto, Kentucky has its annual Holiday Open House Nights on December 7th and the 14th. Right now, we have 210 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at WhiskyCast.com. Just click on the search button to find out what's happening in your area or wherever you may be traveling soon.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. The Cuthbert brothers, Francis and Ian, are the latest generation of Cuthberts to work the Daftmill Farm in Fife, Scotland. There's no record of whether their ancestors may have made some whiskey back in the day, but the history of their Pitlair estate goes back hundreds of years. Back in December of 2005, the brothers made some history of their own when they opened the Daftmill Distillery, and Francis Cuthbert started laying down their first casks of whiskey, distilling during the winter and farming all year long. While other small distilleries started popping up all over Scotland, Daftmill quietly stayed in the background and waited until last year to release its first single malt, a 12-year-old cask-strength whiskey with only 629 bottles for the world. Since then, they've released new whiskeys each summer and winter, along with several single casks for sale at Royal Mile Whiskies, Luvians, and shops in Europe and Taiwan. Now, their first U.S. release is on the way to retailers, and I caught up with Francis Cuthbert on the phone this week. I've been wanting to have you on the show for about a year and a half or so now. We've been talking about this, and I'm glad we finally got you on.
Yeah, it seems to have taken forever. I can't remember why it never happened before, but...
well, because you're running a farm and a distillery at the same time.
Yeah, it soaks up a lot of time.
Tell me about the balance, because I know you don't distill year-round and you don't farm year-round, but you have to sort of balance the two, right?
Well, farming goes on year-round, 24 hours, 365 days a year, but certain times of the year we are busier than other times. So in March and April through into May, we are busy planting barley, planting potatoes, getting the cattle from inside and out to grass and putting fertilizer on and just getting everything growing. Then in middle of June through July and the beginning of August, things are a little bit quieter on the farm, work-wise. So I do a little bit of distilling at this time. Then into August is the start of our harvest time. So August, September is busy with harvest, baling straw, getting straw inside, selling barley, those kind of jobs. Then into October, when we're lifting potatoes, the cattle come back off grass and come back in to be housed in the sheds. So I've got that to do, and that sort of thing. So by mid-November, or about now, thoughts again turn to distilling. And we can distill mid-November, December, January, February.
And that's really the way that Scottish farmers used to do this back in the day, a couple of hundred years ago, was combine farming and distilling and try to make a living from both.
Yeah. You, I don't know if the distilling was so much a living as a profitable sideline or just a nice wee winter hobby. But very very similar, and for exactly the same reasons as well. People had more time in the winter months when at the moment we've had several inches of rain. So you don't want to go out on the land because you just make a mess, whereas you can work away quietly with your still and produce something for the future.
How did you and your brother decide to start the distillery in the first place?
Good question. One we get asked quite a lot, but don't really have a good answer. It was something that was thought about and discussed for many, many years. But it was more a joke than actually taken seriously. And I suppose it wasn't until I met a retired distillery manager who then put us in touch with an engineer who worked in the distilling industry that we started to actually look at, was this actually feasibly possible? Could a distillery fit in these buildings we had, and could we operate it, and more importantly, could we actually afford to do this?
Let's name some names here. Who gets the blame for this?
Who gets the blame for what?
Your distillery manager and the engineer. Let's name some names here.
The first guy we met was a guy, John McDougall, ex-distillery manager from Lafroig and Balvenie and various other distilleries he's worked around in Scotland. And he put us in touch with a guy, Ron Gibson, who was also involved at the same time in building Kilhoman over in Islay, and previously built Caninvie for grants. So that was the sort of the initial thing, and then Ron put us in touch with Jim Swan, and through Jim, then Harry Rifkind at Tatlock and Thompson, and you learn a bit more, and then you meet other people, and you learn a bit more again, and it just sort of snowballs along like that.
Sort of like the entire whiskey business.
Yeah, kind of.
When you decided to start laying down your whiskey, you made the decision back in 05, 06 that you weren't going to bottle any of it right after 3 years. You waited, I think, almost 12 years before you released those first bottles.
Yes.
Why?
One, it takes us a long time to do anything, and two, the nature of the business, and we produce very small quantities, even by small distillery standards. We produce very little, so to make any kind of return, the whiskey needs to be a premium product, and we were of the opinion that you couldn't really ask a premium price for a 3-year-old whiskey, not if you wanted people to come back and buy another bottle.
When you opened the distillery, craft distilling and the small-scale distilling movement was really in its infancy, not only in Scotland, but over here in the U.S., and you were really one of the first pioneers in bringing back grain-to-glass farm distilling. What were you thinking as all these other distilleries started popping up all over Scotland, and people were sort of jumping ahead while your whiskeys were maturing in the bond?
No, I don't know what we were thinking. Good luck to them. Ourselves and Kilhoman opened within a week of each other. Kilhoman chose to release their whiskey at 3-year-old and have been very successful. We've taken almost the opposite path, and so far ours has been very well received as well. So, each business has to find its own route, its own path, and what suits us maybe doesn't suit someone else, and vice versa.
Was it hard for you to maintain that position as you saw all these other whiskeys hitting the market?
There wasn't a lot of whiskey hitting the market really before we considered releasing. The 3-year wait meant most of the new distilleries had barely got 3-year-old whiskey by the time we started releasing. So I don't think there's probably one or two were out before us, but it's not. It wasn't a major consideration. Obviously, there was slight fear that when we launched, if there was a lot of other whiskies at the same time, you might get lost in the crowd a little. But I can't remember it being a major motivating factor.
When you're out there working the fields and growing the barley that you're going to turn into whiskey, give me a sense of what it's like out there on a daily basis when you're doing the farming side of things.
Well, the farming's interesting because every day is different. You wake up in the morning and you look out the window, and depending what the weather is doing can dictate what jobs you can or can't get done that day. Sometimes it can be very frustrating because you've got something to finish off, and because it's rained overnight, it means you won't get it finished that day, and you don't know when it will get finished. But each day is varied, each job's varied, which always keeps it interesting. And then you come into the distillery, and it's the opposite. You try to be as consistent as possible and every day. But it's good.
Your whiskies have been widely acclaimed by those who have been lucky enough to get their hands on them.
Yes.
Does it bother you that you don't have more to sell?
Well, when we started, we didn't know if it would sell or not. And so the fear was if we produced too much and it's difficult to sell, what do we do with it? So the joke at the time was, if it turns out to be bad, we're going to have to drink it all ourselves. And if it turns out to be really good, we're going to drink it all ourselves. If it's in the middle somewhere, we'll maybe sell it. So it would be nice if you could just turn on the tap and have an unlimited quantity to sell. But we're stuck selling what we made 10, 12 years ago, the same as every other whisky company. And we don't have a crystal ball. We can't predict the future. So you've just to do the best you can.
I know you're working with Berry Brothers and Rudd to handle all the distribution. Yes. How did that come about?
The guy who works for Berry Brothers and Rudd approached us and asked if we would consider them for the distribution. And we had various meetings over a couple of years, and it felt like a good fit.
And their connections led to Hodling, because I know Hodling and Company in the U.S. does the Berry Brothers imports for them.
Yes.
So I'm assuming it was a logical connection for you as well.
Yes. Well, let's say I don't really have a huge input into the distribution side of the business. I leave that to Berry Brothers. So that was entirely Berry Brothers and Rudd using Hodling.
I have to ask, where did the name Daftmill come from?
It's the name of the farm that where we live and where the distillery is. I was never overly keen on using the name Daftmill for the whiskey. I always thought would choose something else. Something, I was frightened Daftmill would be seen as a sort of a gimmicky name, like sort of pig's nose or something, sheep dip or something like that. And we've always tried to make a quality spirit. So I wanted a the, like a the Macallan or the Balvenie or something like that. But I never came up with a better name, so we just went with the name of the farm.
I know that on your website you do not encourage visitors, though you have a very picturesque distillery. Might that change in the future?
No plans to at the moment. But we struggle to manage the number of people that turn up as it is.
And people just show up out of the blue hoping to get a tour, and they don't realize that you're not open to the public for tours. Yeah.
Or sometimes they do realize we're not open to tours, but turn up anyway. So visitors are strictly by appointment only. We just don't have time to take a couple of hours out of your day to show people around.
But you'd give them a tour if they say mucked out the stalls or something, right?
Oh, well, not really, no.
I'm kidding, of course.
Yeah.
Tell me what the future is for Daftmill. Where do you and your brother hope to be, say, 10 years from now?
Good question. We're 10 years older, probably. More than that, it's difficult to foresee. We're still slightly amazed at how well things have gone. So we're still hardly believing that this can carry on forever. I think the curiosity will pass and people will move on to something else. But so I don't know. I don't know where we'll be. Probably doing pretty much the same thing as we are at the moment.
The U.S. debut of Daftmill comes in the chill of autumn, but it's actually their 2006 summer release, 12 years old, and matured in 7 first fill ex-bourbon barrels. Only 1,680 bottles will be available in the U.S. The recommended retail price, $250 each. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. We heard from the members of the Coastal Virginia Whiskey Society. They were over the moon to be picked as this month's Whiskey Club of the Month. We've heard from some more whiskey clubs this month, including the Nanaimo Whiskey Club in British Columbia, the Mosner Whiskey Club in Tel Aviv, Israel, and the Taichung Whiskey Society in Taiwan. We pick a new Whiskey Club of the Month on the first episode of each month. There's still time to get your club in the running for December. The winning club each month receives 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at your club tastings, and all you have to do to enter is use the contact form at whiskycast.com. Tell us about your club, and if you have a website or a social media presence, tell us about it. We'll be glad to add a link to your club on our Whiskey Clubs page in the pub section at the WhiskyCast website. We want to thank the folks at Glencairn Crystal for supporting the Whiskey Club of the Month. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Let's start off this week with Glengoyne's Legacy Series, Chapter 1. It's matured in a combination of first fill Oloroso sherry casks and refill casks, and it's bottled at 48% ABV. The nose has notes of honey, figs, toffee, and just a touch of butterscotch. The taste has a great balance of spices and fruity notes, with hints of cinnamon and allspice, along with red apples, toffee, and a touch of coconut. The long finish fades away gently with hints of red apples and subtle spices. I'm scoring Glengoyne's Legacy Series Chapter 1 single malt a 91. Next up, the Adams Port Cask Tasmanian single malt from Adams Distillery in Australia. This one is matured entirely in a French oak ex-port cask, and it's bottled at 48% ABV. I reviewed the cask strength version in September during episode 782, but I brought this one home with me from Australia. The nose is fruity with red grapes, raisins, toffee, and blackberries. The taste has a good balance with blackberries, red grapes, hints of fig cookies, and subtle spices, while the finish is long and fruity with just a hint of clove that comes alive in the background. I've said this before, when the distillers in Tasmania can get their production capacities up to compete on a global stage, watch out. I'm scoring the Adams Port Cask Tasmanian single malt a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey, celebrating the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Louisville's Rabbit Hole Distilling recently rebranded its whiskeys and named its newest bourbon in honor of Christian Heigold, a 19th century German immigrant who settled with his family in what's now known today as Waterfront Park, close to where Rabbit Hole's distillery is located. Heigold is bottled at 47.5% ABV and is just shy of 4 years old. The nose has notes of charred oak, caramel, vanilla, brown sugar, and hints of spice and tobacco leaves. The taste is spicy with black pepper and cinnamon notes, balanced nicely by honey, vanilla, and hints of molasses and brown sugar. Adding some water brings out a touch of cocoa powder on the palate as well. Now, the finish is long and slightly dry with lingering spices and hints of molasses and brown sugar, but once again, adding some water brings out a hint of cocoa powder, and it gives the spices a little kick too. I'm scoring Rabbit Hole's Heigold Bourbon a 91. Finally, while the Victoria Whiskey Festival in British Columbia is still a couple of months away, the Strath in Victoria has already unveiled its 2020 Victoria Whiskey Festival bottling. It's an Old Perth blended malt from Morrison and Mackay in Scotland, and Adam Bradshaw of the Strath sent me a sample of it recently. Now, there is no age statement, but it's a blend of casks from Kalila, Athrusk, Blair Athol, and an undisclosed distillery called simply Speyside's Finest. You may have seen that term used on other independent bottlings in the past. And while I can't be 100% sure, and Adam didn't tell me, I'm guessing it comes from a distillery just to the east of the town of Aberlour, one that does not allow its name to be used on independent bottlings. Anyway, Old Perth is bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has just a slight hint of peat smoke along with grilled fruits, apple pie, nutmeg, and a nice maltiness. The taste starts off syrupy sweet, followed by a nice burst of white pepper, coriander, and cardamom spices, complemented by apple pie, touches of figs and dates, and just a slight hint of peat smoke. The finish is long with an excellent balance of spices and fruitiness, along with just a slight kiss of smoke. I'm scoring the Old Perth 2020 Victoria Whiskey Festival bottling for the Strath a 93. And I hope you'll join us in January for our special coverage from the Victoria Whiskey Festival. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,700 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at WhiskyCast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's open up the inbox now for your voice, presented by Lot 40. Got this email the other day, and for obvious reasons, I'll keep the sender anonymous. I'm a big fan and have been listening to WhiskyCast for quite some time. I'm interested in selling a bottle of E.H. Taylor Seasoned Wood. What is the best avenue for selling privately owned whiskey? Well, I get this question a lot, and almost always the answer is the same. In most states, there is no legal way to sell a privately owned bottle of whiskey except through a licensed auction house in the states where that's legal. You see, most states don't make any distinction in their laws between rare collectible bottles of whiskey and something one might sell at an unlicensed after-hours club. Kentucky does allow individuals to sell so-called vintage bottles of whiskey and other spirits to licensed bars and retailers, with some restrictions. The bottle must never have been opened, and it can't be anything currently available on the market. Now, that Colonel E.H. Taylor Seasoned Wood Bourbon was a limited edition release from Buffalo Trace back in 2016. While there might possibly be a few bottles left on store shelves, it is no longer available for retailers to order directly from Buffalo Trace's distributors, so it would qualify under Kentucky's restrictions. And, by the way, if you know someone who might try to buy or sell rare whiskeys on Craigslist or other online sites, you might remind them that in some states, police have been known to answer those ads and then arrest the seller for violating state laws. This past Tuesday, November 12th, marked the 14th anniversary of the very first episode of WhiskyCast, way back in 2005. And Colderack on Twitter sent this question. I was wondering, Mark, are you living from this, or do you have a job and do WhiskyCast on the side? I guess it's your job as with the news and interviews and the editing after that. It must be really time-consuming. Well, as much as I really try to make this more about the whiskeys than about us, we sort of blew that out of the water last time around when my partner here at WhiskyCast and Cask Strength Media, Christina Filburn, decided to stick the microphone in my face for a change. Early on, WhiskyCast was a hobby, but it evolved over the years as we started getting interest from advertisers. And 10 years ago, after I was laid off from a television news job in New York City during the recession, it wound up becoming my full-time job, and Christina's as well. You don't hear from her very often on WhiskyCast, but she manages the business side of things and works with our advertising partners. That lets me focus on gathering news and interviews, along with the other things that go into producing each week's podcast. Thanks for the question. Now, we also had a contest this week to celebrate the anniversary. Our friends at Redbreast gave us their remaining stash of water bottles, or really big flasks, depending on whatever you want to use them for. So I posted a photo of one on social media and asked you to guess how much fluid it holds in ounces. That's important because we had a bunch of guesses in milliliters, and as Klaus Dobelman tweeted from Austria, I didn't even try. These imperial measures freak me out. The correct answer was 16 ounces, as stamped into the bottom of the water bottle, and our original plan was to pick a winner at random from all of the correct entries. But out of all of the dozens of guesses we had across Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, only 5 people got it right. So we're going to send each of them a Redbreast water bottle. Congratulations to Emmett Hossack, Scott Rogers, Andy Powell, at Stoddard FC, and at Dilly ESQ. And Scott Rogers tweeted back, listened to the new WhiskyCast pod this morning, so I'm already a winner today. Hopefully the 16-ounce bottle is a prophecy, both that Redbreast releases a 16-year-old expression and that WhiskyCast will roll strong into and beyond its 16th season. Well, we're just starting our 15th year this week, but Redbreast does have a 15-year-old whiskey. You know what to do from here, gang. And thanks to everyone for their kind words this week on the anniversary. We do plan to have some kind of celebration next year for the 15th anniversary of WhiskyCast. If you have some suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. Look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also email us directly. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all the other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. Last time around, I was at Virginia's Mount Vernon for the first George Washington Whiskey Festival. If you've ever visited the distillery at Mount Vernon, you might have noticed a fairly old, fairly small copper still sitting off to one side next to the window. We should say that's a very old still. You see, while the working stills at the distillery are all modern replicas built by Vendome in Louisville, they're based on that old still. And by old, we're talking circa 1784 old. It was not part of the original distillery at Mount Vernon. It was donated to the estate by Melvin Wilkins, and he shared the amazing stories behind that still with me the other night.
Well, my grandfather purchased it from a constable that was getting ready to destroy it in 1932, and the constable ended up selling the still to my grandfather for the price of the scrap metal. And then my grandfather kept it from the 30s up until sometime in the 50s, and then the still was stolen, and the still was submerged in a local pond for about 20 years. And my parents were in a junk store in Princeton, North Carolina, and there was an older gentleman in there that overheard my mother making her introduction and telling who her father was. So he made a confession and said, I was with this other man, and we stole the still and submerged it in a pond. So my dad went to the farmhouse and said, hey, I think there's something that belongs to my family in the pond. So they let him wade out there, and he finally found it, and then they pulled it out with a tractor. So, it stayed in our home for several years, and then my parents eventually gave the still to me. And I was at work one evening, and my brother showed me a USA Today paper when they were getting ready to rebuild the distillery. He said, that looks like your still. So I called up and spoke to the project manager and said, hey, I've got a 1784 copper liquor still, and I'm considering donating it. So he asked for some pictures. I sent some pictures up here, and then we made a trip up here, and we decided it's better for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to be able to see that still versus just my family. So that's kind of the fast version of the story.
And that's the still that's right inside the window along the side of the building, right?
It's on the second floor.
I have seen that still and taken pictures of it, and thank you for sharing it with the rest of the world.
There's another interesting story. If you examine the side of the still, there's it was evidently confiscated by the Union Army, and their unit has been pinged into the side of the still. You can barely see it, but you can see like 2nd Battalion, Company A or whatever is in there. So it's pretty fascinating how all that transpired.
I'll post some photos of that still on our social media feeds and at the WhiskyCast website. And I really need to give credit to John Campbell of Lefroy for this one. When I walked up to him last Saturday night, he was talking to Melvin, and John looked at me and said, "You've got to hear this story." I am so glad I listened to him. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find the links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at WhiskyCast.com. That's also where you'll find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast. You'll also find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, you'll find a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to that very first one in 2005. We love hearing from you. You can always use the contact form at WhiskyCast.com. Get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or email us. The address? Comments at WhiskyCast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch Whisky, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.